The Devil You Know deals with one of my favourite areas of crime. That's familial crime, for the most part. As the title suggests, it's all about people who have committed crimes and their family obviously didn't know they were criminals, didn't know what they were up to, and it's told primarily through the perspective of the family or the close friends and how they found out what their partners, brothers, sisters, parents were doing. This is 4 seasons. It's currently on Crime and Investigation on Amazon Prime, which is where I watched it. And it's about 30 episodes, and as soon as the first episode was done, I basically binge-watched the rest over the course of about 10 days. And it's so addictive and really great. So the documentary itself is very well edited, very well put together. We get to hear from a lot of different people. Obviously, we hear from victims who have survived, family members of those who were affected. There are some cases where the crime isn't murder. I will say, obviously, a lot of these are murder, very serious crimes. But there are cases where it's like theft or embezzlement, and we get to hear from those who have been directly affected. And that's obviously really interesting and emotive and very powerful. And we get to hear from detectives and journalists and people who were involved in the case. I think it's got a really good mix of opinions. It's not biased as such, but at the same time, it's told from the perspective of that person being guilty. And I think every single case except one had a convicted felon. I think there might have been one, if I remember correctly, where they weren't found guilty on all charges. I could be wrong. But obviously it's told from the perspective of them being convicted. It's assumed that each of these cases, they are guilty. There's no kind of looking at whether or not they were falsely accused. They are guilty. This is what they did. This is how they did it. This is how they were found out. Because obviously with a lot of these people, they've been getting away with it for a long time. And I think the documentary's done quite sensitively. You know, it's well edited, we get a lot of great opinions, but the way it presents the development of these individuals' crimes is really effective, because it's quite easy to look at this and think, well, how could you possibly not know that your husband, for example, was going out raping and murdering girls? But it doesn't ever make you feel like they're blaming the family for not picking up on it or anything. A lot of people will judge them for not being able to see these signs, but obviously when you're in that situation, it's very, very different. And as I said, a lot of this is familial crime, and that's obviously something that's quite powerful, because I think every single person who watches The Devil You Know will have that thought of, is my loved one committing a crime I don't know about? If it can happen to these 30 plus families, then could it happen to me? And then the short answer to that is yes. Your loved one, your best friend, somebody you work with, they could be a criminal. Thankfully, for most of us, that's very unlikely, but it just goes to show that you don't always know somebody. We get a nice mix of footage, and there's one particular case involving a robbery that kind of used a lot of CCTV footage, and that was really involved. You kind of felt like you knew what was going on. I think, for the most part, I hadn't heard of any of these cases. There were 2, maybe 3, that I'd heard of. I think definitely one about a serial arsonist. I won't say what happened or who it was, but there's one with a serial arsonist that I was familiar with. But for the most part, these were fresh cases I hadn't heard of. Some of the cases are really monumental, involving a lot of deaths, and that's obviously tragic. Some of the cases are a little bit more low-key, and they're just about people, I guess, being fraudulent, which is obviously very severe, but just pretending to be somebody you're not is not always going to be as bad as murder. So there's a really good mix in there. It's very addictive, very well kind of delivered and presented. If you like true crime, I think you'll like this. It's got a good level of graphics to it. There are crime scene photos, nothing overly, in your face. So if you're maybe not the biggest fan of things that are too gory, I think you'll be perfectly fine with this. But it does utilise crime scene evidence where possible to tell these stories. So effective. You will feel for some of the victims. most of the victims, in fact. It's absolutely brilliant. If you haven't seen it and you like true crime, I promise you will love this. It will be the best 30-ish hours of your life. The Devil You Know is brilliant, a great study into familial crime, and probably a series that I would happily recommend. Then return to. The first season was out in 2010. I'm not sure if there are plans for more, and the last season was in 2013, so it's unlikely, but fingers crossed. I thought it was brilliant, very well done. I've seen probably hundreds of episodes of true crime, and most of these cases I hadn't heard of. It does the job very well, and I thoroughly enjoyed it.